India has quietly struck back by imposing a 30% tariff on U.S. soybean products. You might not see much coverage of this in the mainstream media, but if you understand the underlying logic of international trade, you'll realize that this is far more than just a tariff adjustment. It's a meticulously designed strategic counterattack. While the world watches Trump wield his tariff stick in all directions, India has chosen an exceptionally clever target: legumes. Yes, those seemingly unremarkable lentils, chickpeas, and yellow peas sitting quietly on your supermarket shelves. But why legumes specifically? Why not steel, chips, or those headline-grabbing strategic materials? To answer this, we must zoom out to the other side of the globe and take in the vast, snow-covered North American plains. North Dakota and Montana, names that might seem like obscure symbols in geography textbooks to many. However, delve into America's political landscape and a harsh reality emerges. These seemingly remote states exert a level of influence in Washington's corridors of power that is far disproportionate to their populations. The Senate's rules dictate that every state, whether it has 30 million or 300,000 residents, holds 2 Senate seats. This means that every vote in these vast, sparsely populated agricultural states carries significant weight. The economic lifeline of these states is precisely tied to those golden legume crops. 一教腾, when combine harvesters roar across North Dakota's fields. They gather not just lentils and chickpeas, but also the most crucial political bargaining chips held by the state's senators. Standing at the edge of these seemingly endless fields, you can see mile upon mile of legume plantations and smell the earthy scent of ripening crops in the air. Most of these farmers are the third or fourth generation descendants of immigrants who arrived in this barren land in the late 19th century and built today's agricultural empire with their own 2 hands. For them, growing legumes is not just a profession, but a family legacy. Every bean embodies their attachment to the land and their hopes for the future. However, India's recent change in tariff policy means that they now face the stark reality that their year-long harvest may remain unsold or be forced into fire sales at prices far below cost. This anxiety quickly escalated to the political level. These senators understood only too well how their farming constituents, who had devoted their lives to the land, would express their anger at the ballot box if India's market doors closed. So, they did what politicians do best and wrote letter after letter to Trump, demanding in stern terms that India's tariffs be removed and negotiations for a bilateral trade agreement be accelerated. This wasn't a request, it was pressure. In America's political ecosystem, farmers are a group that can never be ignored. Though not numerous, they boast high voter turnout, strong organization, and the ability to influence election outcomes in swing states. Anyone seeking must not let them down. History shows that the influence of agricultural states lies behind every major U.S. trade policy shift. In the 1980s, for example, the Reagan administration's grain embargo against the Soviet Union sparked a fierce backlash from American farmers, ultimately forcing policy revisions. When Trump launched the trade war against China in 2018, it was American farmers who suffered the most severe impact. The government had to allocate hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies just to quell their discontent. Yet a deeper question lingers. Why is the US so fixated on opening India's agricultural market? On the surface, it's clearly about economic interests. India, with a population of 1.4 billion, is the world's second largest market for soybeans. If American soybeans could be sold there consistently, the profit margins would be enormous. According to USDA data, almost 40% of US soybean production depends on exports. If the Indian market were fully opened, it could theoretically absorb over 20% of total US soybean exports. For farmers, this would generate billions of dollars in revenue. However, if you think this is merely a business style, you are being naive. In the eyes of Washington policymakers, agriculture has never just been about farming. It's a diplomatic bargaining chip, a strategic tool, and a cornerstone of food hegemony. History has proven time and again that whoever controls the food supply chain holds the upper hand at the negotiating table. One of the key factors that enabled the US to establish its global hegemonic system after World War II was agricultural. The Marshall Plan wasn't just about providing Europe with funds. Crucially, it also exported food, making those war-ravaged nations dependent on American agricultural supplies during their reconstruction. By the time of the Cold War, the US had weaponized food by imposing grain embargoes on the Soviet Union and Eastern European countries in order to achieve political objectives by controlling their food supply. This strategy persists today. By exporting cheap food around the world, the US not only generates profits, but also fosters dependence on its food security among countless nations. Once a country is reliant on another's food supply, it finds it politically difficult to take a hard line against that provider. This constitutes an invisible form of control that is more covert and enduring than military threats. Thus, when the US sets its sights on India's agricultural market, its ambitions extend far beyond selling a few shiploads of beans. The aim was to make India dependent on the United States for its food supply chain, thereby gaining an advantage in broader geopolitical games. Underpinning this is an even grander strategic consideration. In the eyes of the United States, India is a key counterweight to China. To truly make India a reliable ally, the two countries must be tightly bound economically. Opening the agricultural market is just one part of this grand plan. But India clearly saw through this. Fast forward to New Delhi in those ancient government buildings. Indian policymakers are faced with an extraordinarily complex dilemma. They recognize that rejecting US demands could lead to diplomatic pressure and potentially disrupt cooperation in other areas. Yet they also recognize that conceding on agriculture could have catastrophic consequences. In India, pulses are not just commodities. They are the lifeline for 300 million vegetarians. Walk into any Indian kitchen and you will see that pulses are held in a status almost equivalent to that of rice in Chinese culture. In traditional Indian households, mothers start every day by rinsing pulses to prepare the day's meals. Lentil curries, hummus, and mung bean soups are not just sustenance, but are also integral to cultural identity. For families who abstain from meat for religious reasons, lentils, chickpeas, and mung beans are their main source of protein. The tenets of Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism all emphasize nonviolence and vegetarianism, making India home to the world's largest vegetarian population. Statistics indicate that nearly 40% of Indians adhere to a strict vegetarian diet, with legumes occupying a central role in their diet. If legume prices increase dramatically or there are supply issues, it's not just thousands or tens of thousands of people who are affected, it's hundreds of millions. India learned a profound lesson during the global food crisis from 2006 to 2008. At that time, international grain prices soared and the cost of legumes, which India relied heavily on imports for, more than doubled. This directly plunged tens of millions of impoverished families into malnutrition. Urban areas witnessed panic buying, with supermarket shelves emptied of legumes, even triggering localized social unrest. This crisis made the Indian government realize that food security could never depend on international markets, and that it must build its own production capacity and reserve systems. Furthermore, India has 30 million farmers whose livelihoods depend on legume cultivation. These 30 million people are not just statistics. They represent 30 million families, forming the bedrock of India's rural society and representing a political force that no ruling party would want to antagonize. In rural India, legume cultivation is often the main source of income for smallholder farmers. Unlike rice and wheat, which require large expanses of flat land and complex irrigation systems, legumes have relatively low soil and water requirements, making them ideal for smallholders with limited resources. Most of these farmers live in states such as Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, and Maharashtra, where household incomes may amount to just a few $1,000s a year. The success of their legume harvests directly determines whether they can sustain a basic livelihood. However, if large volumes of cheap American legumes were to flood the market, local legume prices would rapidly fall, drastically reducing these farmers' incomes and potentially leaving them with nothing. How powerful are farmer protests? Between 2020 and 2021, farmers sustained demonstrations around New Delhi for over a year over just a handful of demands. This ultimately forced the Modi government to withdraw the legislation completely. The sheer scale and prolonged duration of the protests shocked the world. Hundreds of thousands of farmers traveled from all over the country to set up tents at the borders of New Delhi, block major roads, and refuse to leave. They brought enough food and supplies to last months, signaling their determination to fight to the end. Sadly, over 700 farmers lost their lives during the protests, some due to harsh weather conditions, some in clashes with the police, and some elderly farmers succumbing to heart attacks caused by prolonged stress. The protests escalated into a nationwide political crisis, causing Modi's approval ratings to plummet and the ruling party to suffer crushing defeats in subsequent local elections. The Indian government has learned this lesson so profoundly that it must now tread cautiously with any agricultural policy. Thus, when the Indian government decided to impose a 30% tariff on U.S. pulses, its calculations were clear. While some urban consumers might face higher prices in the short term, this move would protect the interests of domestic farmers, stabilize the domestic market, and prevent reliance on foreign sources for food security in the long term. This was not an emotional decision, but a rational, strategic choice. Indian policymakers also considered another important factor. They understood that opening the agricultural market completely would affect far more than just soybean farmers. It would have an impact on the entire agricultural supply chain. This network involves hundreds of millions of people, from seed suppliers and fertilizer distributors to grain buyers, processing plants, transport companies, and retailers. If this network were to collapse under the pressure of foreign agricultural products, the consequences would be catastrophic. Yet a more nuanced question remains. Why did India choose this particular moment to act? With Trump back in the White House, his trade policies defy conventional logic. Rather than serving as economic tools, tariffs are used as bargaining chips. He can impose duties on allies today and suddenly grant exemptions tomorrow, depending on whether the counteroffer is sufficiently enticing. Examining Trump's trade policies during his first term reveals a clear pattern. Threaten first, apply pressure then. Negotiate and finally sign a deal he can boast about. With Canada and Mexico, for example, he threatened to scrap an AFTA, ultimately forcing them to sign the more favorable USMCA. He threatened hefty tariffs on automobiles against the EU, forcing Europe to make concessions in other areas. He used the same tactics against Japan and South Korea to renegotiate trade agreements. Each time, he squeezed more benefits out of his counterparts. In this climate of extreme uncertainty, India risks finding itself in a much weaker position at the negotiating table if it passively waits. So India has chosen to take the offensive. By imposing tariffs on U.S. soybeans, India sent a clear message to Washington. We are not a nation to be manipulated at will. We have our own bottom lines, and we are willing to pay the price to defend them. This is both a stance and a warning. India's strategy is clear. Strike first before Trump formally confronts India. Seize the initiative and demonstrate to the US that India is not an easy target. This strategy is underpinned by a deeper logic. Indian diplomats have studied Trump's psychology and concluded that, although he is tough, he also respects opponents who dare to fight back. If you constantly back down, he will perceive you as weak and vulnerable, which will embolden him to press further. However, if you demonstrate a firm stance and make him aware that pushing too hard risks mutual destruction, he may rein in his aggression and become more willing to engage in serious talks. However, the issue doesn't end there. The U.S. India relationship has never been solely about legumes. If you closely observe the trajectory of U.S. India relations in recent years, an intriguing pattern emerges. The two nations have grown increasingly intertwined at the strategic level, yet their economic and trade ties are fraught with conflict. The US is courting India as a counterweight to China and is providing substantial support in the security, technology, and defense sectors. The Quad Security Dialogue, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and advanced technology cooperation are all gestures of goodwill from the US to India. The US has even tacitly permitted India to purchase Russian oil, despite this contravening Western sanctions against Russia. However, when it comes to tangible economic interests such as agriculture, tariffs, and market access, both nations remain unyielding and unwilling to compromise. The stark reality of international relations is that strategic cooperation can be discussed at great length. But when core economic interests are at stake, so-called alliances often prove fragile. The soybean tariff dispute is merely a microcosm of this broader tension. Look more closely, and you will find that friction between the US and India extends far beyond soybeans. The US has consistently pressured India to open its dairy market. American dairy farmers want to export milk, cheese, and butter to India. But India has erected extremely high barriers, citing religious and cultural reasons. The US also wants India to ease restrictions on poultry imports. But India refuses to open its market due to concerns about avian flu risks. Disagreements over intellectual property rights are even more acute. The US claims that India's patent laws are too lenient, enabling domestic companies to manufacture generic versions of American drugs and causing harm to US pharmaceutical firms. India counters that medicines are a special type of good concerning public health that cannot be fully subject to market forces, and asserts its right as a developing nation to take special measures to ensure its citizens have access to essential drugs. In the digital economy, India has introduced data localization policies that require multinational corporations to store Indian users' data within the country. This has drawn strong opposition from US tech giants, as it significantly increases their operational costs and weakens their control over data. That the US government has repeatedly pressured India to repeal these policies, but India has refused to compromise, citing national security concerns. These disagreements have created significant tension in U.S. India economic and trade relations. In future negotiations, the two nations are expected to engage in fierce battles over additional agricultural products. The U.S. will demand that India opens its dairy market, reduces poultry import restrictions, and relaxes pesticide standards. However, India will defend its agricultural protection policies by erecting barriers through quotas, licenses, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, and other tools. Each round of talks will be extremely challenging, with every compromise facing significant domestic political pressure. But who will truly emerge victorious in this game of give and take? American farmers naturally hope for full market access in India, allowing their legumes to enter freely. However, even if India were to eliminate tariffs, it is not necessarily the case that American legumes would dominate the Indian market. Not necessarily. India's domestic production capacity for legumes is expanding rapidly. Thanks to lower cultivation costs, a deeper understanding of local consumer preferences, and shorter logistics distances, the Indian government has been actively modernizing agriculture in recent years, increasing both the yield and quality of pulses. They have introduced new seed varieties, upgraded irrigation systems, and provided increased technical training and financial support. These measures are already yielding results, with India's pulse production increasing by over 20% in the past 5 years. If this trend continues, India could very well achieve self-sufficiency in pulses, or even become a net exporter. In the long term, American farmers may find that securing market access does not guarantee the expected level of profit. Indian farmers naturally hope that their government will maintain protection against foreign legume imports. But the question remains, could excessive protectionism undermine their competitiveness? Might it trap India's agricultural sector in a cycle of inefficiency? This is a question without a simple answer. History offers countless examples of how excessive trade protection ultimately harms the industries it is intended to protect. When an industry is sheltered for too long and deprived of external competitive pressure, it becomes inefficient, rigid, and unable to innovate. India's traditional industries, such as steel and automotive manufacturing, once found themselves in this situation due to prolonged protectionism. It was only when the government was forced to open up the markets that these industries began to reform and upgrade under competitive pressure. Will the pulses industry repeat this mistake? This is a question that Indian policymakers must seriously consider. From a consumer's perspective, whether in the US or India, the primary concerns have always been price and quality rather than trade policy. Tariffs may be imposed and lifted, but it is often ordinary people who ultimately bear the cost. In India, Rising legume prices directly impact the quality of life for hundreds of millions of households, particularly those on low incomes. For these families, a 10 rupee increase in the price of legumes per kilogram may mean having to cut back on other expenses, such as children's education or healthcare. This impact is tangible and quantifiable pain. In the United States, losses suffered by farmers who are unable to export legumes will ultimately have an impact on the entire economic system. Banks will tighten agricultural loans. Equipment suppliers will see reduced orders, and rural communities will experience declining purchasing power. This chain reaction affects far more than just the farmers themselves. So in this trade war sparked by policies, are there truly any winners? Perhaps not. Perhaps everyone is merely trying to protect their own interests in this massive game of chess, while inevitably bearing the resulting costs. But one thing is certain, this game is far from over. In truth, beans are just the beginning. Against the backdrop of retreating globalization and rising trade protectionism, similar conflicts will only multiply. Every nation is reassessing its industrial policies, trying to strike a balance between openness and protection. This process will inevitably be fraught with conflict, compromise, and setbacks. The next time you walk into a supermarket and see ordinary legume products on the shelves, pause for a moment to consider countless struggles between nations. Countless farmers' livelihoods and countless politicians' calculations lie behind these seemingly mundane foods, as well as countless games of power invisible to ordinary people. Every single bean carries a complex story. Harvested in fields in the United States or India, it is cleaned, graded and packaged before traveling through intricate logistics networks to reach your city. Along the way, its price is influenced by numerous factors, such as tariff policies, exchange rate fluctuations, transportation costs, and market supply and demand. These factors are influenced by the strategic maneuvers and trade-offs of various interest groups. The world is always more complex than we realize. The forces that truly shape history often lie hidden within the most unassuming of details. Trade wars are never abstract economic concepts. They are concrete, tangible realities. They determine whether an American farmer can repay bank loans, whether an Indian family can afford a nutritionally balanced dinner, and whether a politician can keep their seat in the next election. All of these individual micro-level destinies ultimately converge to create macro-level historical processes. Each of us is part of this process, whether we realize it or not. If you're curious about the deeper logic behind international trade and want to understand the real rules that govern how the world operates, remember to subscribe to this channel. We dig up those overlooked truths, one by one, and share them with you. In an age of information overload and a scarcity of truth, we don't need more headlines. We need deeper thinking and a more comprehensive perspective.